So, welcome. I went to write the key dates slide for this workshop, and I realised that there is only really one key date left, which is the final submission. So we really are genuinely on the home stretch of this process. And consequently, the focus of our next hour and a half together is very much down to the tin tacks, you know, the practicalities of how to effectively edit and polish your writing, a bit of reflection on the feedback that you all received in the preliminary draft round. You don't have this advantage, but we do, in that we're able to see the feedback that all applicants get. So I wanted to give you a little window into that feedback by sharing some points that had emerged from that, and to give you a sense of, you know, where you might be tracking compared to other applicants. So we're going to do that. We're going to talk a little bit about budget justifications and a few other things. But that is our plan. And let me, before I get too far ahead of myself, acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we live and work and learn, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and also future in all of the places that we are. Let's begin, and this will be quick because there's not many of us, with a quick check-in. So I want to invite each of you, Mina and Manjo, to give a quick update on, from your perspective, how do you think your team is going, both in terms of practical progress, like how close are you to the finish line, but also well-being, you know, is energy in the team high? Is it waning? Are you really over this? Are you really excited about where it's up to? Anything like that. And then, because the focus of this workshop is on writing and editing, I wonder if you would share the thing that you find most difficult about writing or editing, and the thing that you find the most satisfying.
Would like to start with it, or Nina? I'll probably start.
Okay, super.
Anyway, we've had a few discussions among the team members, and we're setting our first team meeting again on Tuesday of next week. We've had some informal discussions in the form of emails to try to address the feedback from the review panel. And it would appear that based on the feedback from the review panel, it was quite positive, and there appears to be very minimal changes that need to be made, and the group feels that you know, those changes can be quickly addressed. We're going to have a meeting on Tuesday, and I'm trying to make sure that we farm out who does what in terms of making the few changes or providing the ideas. And so, you know, that's going well. And in terms of the hardest aspect of writing, editing, well, to me, it's really about one of the theoretical framework. So I'm talking about the substantive aspect, not so much about the style of writing, because to me, that seems to be easy to do. Once I have the ideas, it's easy to write. But in terms of the substantive aspect, what has been quite a challenge was really working on the theoretical framework. And even now, I'm trying to get a few ideas from the members on how to address the feedback coming from the review panel, that we need to identify the theoretical framework that underpins the research. So that is something that I'm still struggling with, trying to make sense. You know, we've had a discussion in Tilly about this about a week ago, but it's something I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it. It seems like I'm missing something here. And so I'm trying to get, you know, some comments from the group, and that should be forthcoming in a couple of days. The other aspect is the methodology, because my strength has been on qualitative research, and there were questions raised which pertain to the quantitative research about, you know, the generalizability of the findings and what we could do based on the survey results. And so I will need to get input from that, from the other members who are quite strong in terms of the quantitative research. In terms of the most satisfying aspect of writing or editing, I enjoyed writing it because, I mean, it's not like so much I'm the one writing it, but I actually put the whole thing together, and I would suppose I did most of the writing. You know, after getting all the feedback and the input from the other team members, I did the final, you know, the final writing. That was my job, and I enjoyed it for a lot of reasons. One was to think about what research is all about. Thinking in terms of what exactly is theoretical framework. So trying to refresh my mind about what research is. And then it's a new experience, again, to try to think about how to pitch your ideas, because it's one thing to be writing something, but to be very conscious and aware of, the audience you're trying to pitch your ideas to, and why you're doing the research. It's refreshing, because oftentimes, writing is a very solitary activity, and you just want to put your ideas on paper, but you need to be conscious of the fact that you're trying to pitch this to an audience who might not really be familiar with the literature you're writing about. And so that to me was satisfying. And even to talk about the methodology was also satisfying, because to me it was a new learning experience. I was beginning to learn more about quantitative research. And so the whole thing has been, to me, it was a tremendous experience, especially being able to get feedback for free coming from the review panel. And because, again, it's a way for us as researchers to learn, getting this kind of feedback. And so, and I think that kind of experience is shared by the team members as well. And apart from that, it's the fact that I'm trying to lead a research team here of colleagues, and it's been a very good collaborative and a very positive experience for all of us. So I truly enjoy this experience of writing the grant application.
Fantastic. It's not everybody feels that way about writing grant applications, so it's fabulous to hear it. And I'm reading into that in terms of your team's well-being, things are feeling pretty good. Would that be true?
I ask them how they are, if that's what you mean. But because everybody's been busy, it's like looking for the time to do this, but you're teaching and you have other, journal manuscripts you need to work on. So. But otherwise, I suppose everybody has been good.
Great, super. And Nina, how about you? Can you run us through your reactions to these 3 checking in questions? How's it all going in your team?
Oh, well, yes. Okay, thank you, Tilly. Things are going pretty good in our team, and we have had few email exchange. We have, addressed the feedback, and we have had few. After addressing the feedback, the document has gone to every team member, and they have given their own suggestions and their feedback, and it has come back to me, made the changes, gone to them, and probably everyone has approved what is it is coming to a final shape basically. And yes, looking at the feedback, it is quite motivating, and nothing in too much of detail to address, so it was a little bit easier for the team to work onto it. And yes, team is pretty, I would say, motivated and looking forward to have this grant and use it to implement our project. So it is a very short one, but yes, it is going the mental health of all team members are great.
All good. And what about for you? What's the hardest and the most satisfying thing for you about writing or editing?
The feedback has helped. Putting things from here to there, sometimes when a lot of thoughts are coming in your mind, then you can't break those thoughts into which makes really very clear what you want to say. So when it is coming to editing, and also when we have sent it to proofreader, so sending it to proofreader has really small little things which sometimes reading it again and again, you do not realize that you have missed a point, or you have a or the very small grammatical things have been picked up. So yes, I would say it is quite an interesting journey actually.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yes, I would say so. Yeah.
Great, super. Manjaro, I didn't want to let your comment go unaddressed about the theoretical framework still being a bit of a monster for your team. And I wonder if, Marlene, you would know Michael Cowling's movements, but I wonder if a conversation with Michael might be possible as the acting chair of the panel, just to get his perspective on how to frame that section. Might be really useful to have just one extra point of input outside of your team. Marlene, do you reckon that's feasible given where your knowledge of Mike's schedule is at?
Marlene, you might be muted.
Yes, I'm just finding my mute button. Yeah, I'm not quite up with Michael's schedule, although I do know that he's at a workshop in Brisbane today, so he's not available today. But yes, Manjo, if you send me some times that you would like to meet with Michael, then I'll negotiate with him to get something that's sooner rather than later.
Okay, thanks, Marlene. I'll do that.
No worries.
Thank you.
Super. All right.
Okay, I just have a question. Yes, which I raised it in the face-to-face meeting also. So it is 10% when it says word limit. It is 10% here and there. Is it fine?
Plus or minus 10% of what the word limits are. So
so if it is 500, 550.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. And 62?
562. Oh dear. Can you shorten one of your sentences?
I'm trying to.
We are going to talk about shortening sentences in a minute, so maybe you'll be able to skim a few words off.
Thank you.
We just don't want to expand it too much. That's the whole point of the word limits, because the reviewers have to review a number of these. So yeah.
And we need you all to be on an even playing field, because if somebody disregards the word limit and has twice as much space to evince their argument, then it's going to disadvantage the people who are rule abiders. And so that's why we give the 10% leeway, but other than that, we're pretty firm on you needing to write it to the correct link, which I know can be hard.
Yeah, so 10% here and there is fine, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's fine.
Exactly. Okay, so as I forecast earlier, this is our plan for today. We are going to start by looking at the feedback in a collective way. You know your own feedback really intimately because you have pages of it from the review panel. We've had conversations about it, and I just wanted to give you a little overarching picture of that feedback. Then we're going to jump into editing and polishing. Super practical, lots of really tangible tools for you to use, little tricks and tips to follow. We're going to talk briefly about budget justification, and I want to show you an example of one, and then a few notes just about getting through this final lap as you head towards the one and only key date, which is the final submission. And then at the end, I have a dot point for discussion, but you all know how this works. This is very interactive, and please feel free to jump in at any point with comments, questions, your expertise, opinions, or any of that is more than welcome. Please don't feel like you need to hold off till the end. So when I looked across all of the panel feedback, and there was quite a lot of it, as you can probably extrapolate when you think about the volume that you received and then multiply that by the teams who are participating in this process. These were the key themes that emerged.
Can I interrupt you there? Sorry.
Yeah.
Are you going to be providing us a copy of the PowerPoint slides, or do we need to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you will get a copy of these, and you'll also have access to the recording.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I think it takes a little while for the recording to render, and then Marlene will send that whole package out to you. So these were the things, and it would just be worth checking, which of these might resonate with your application and the feedback that you received in particular. So the first one was a desire from the panel that people would do more to highlight the innovation. So, in these grants, there's a constant tension about, is this team wanting money to do what the school should be paying for anyway, or what an academic would be doing in their normal job anyway? And so there were quite a few comments asking this question of, can you tell us more about how you're going beyond curriculum development, how you're doing something that's innovative and something extra from just what the school should support or what your regular job would have you doing in terms of reforming pedagogy or building new curriculum materials or creating an online innovation or whatever the thing might be. The second point is a very, very prevalent one, and this is comments around feasibility. The panel are, they're interested in the theoretical framework, and we'll get to that in a minute, but they're also keenly interested that you're proposing a project that is possible. They don't want to set you up to fail at this. And so invariably in the feedback, there were comments about needing more detail on how things would be done and concerns about, is it really possible to do all this in a 12-month project? Because 12 months is not that long. The amount of funding is not that enormous. And people tend to have a temptation to over-promise. So often there were comments about, is this really possible? Can you really deliver on these big promises in the project that you're proposing? Generalizability came up fairly frequently, a concern that what the project does can echo beyond the initial site at which the change takes place. And that can be generalizability into another discipline, another school, another context. It might happen within the project itself by being interdisciplinary, or it might be a promise, a commitment, they're probably slightly too strong words, an indication that the project would be able to be picked up by others and used after the project has come to an end. And you wanted to be convincing about generalizability. You want to be doing more than saying people could adopt this after the project ends. You want to show that you're setting things up, that it's more than just a possibility, but it's kind of fostered by the things that your project does. It might be things like building some implementation resources. It might be things like having the work mainstreamed into a Moodle site that exists independently of your project. You know, something on StaffNet could be another instance of that, or that it becomes part of the routine work within a school or a work area, to show that you're not just hoping for the best once the project is done, but that it really can and probably will be generalized out to other contexts. Research questions perennially are pretty difficult. The two main critiques in the feedback this year was that some applications had too many research questions, and there's no magic number of how many there ought to be, but the panel is always thinking about, is it going to be feasible to answer all of those questions meaningfully and robustly with the data that the project is gathering? So it was a critique in some applications that there were too many of them. And then a kind of semi-related critique was that some research questions were not actually answerable by the proposed research. And typically that would be one of the set of questions. There would be no resonance of it in any other part of the application. Maybe it was in there as an afterthought, or it was an edit that didn't get fixed up before the submission of the preliminary draft, but there's this mismatch between the research questions and then the plan for how the research is going to happen. The next area, and this gets to Manjo's point, is around the theoretical framework. So several applications got feedback around the framework being either missing from the application, it being unclear, or lastly, that the way that the application was written didn't show that the researchers had a good command of the framework. So yeah, there was a framework, it was backed up with literature, but the panel weren't able to be confident that the research team really knew how to use that framework or kind of understood it. There's another cluster of things around existing projects, and essentially what was being said by the panel here was, can you tell us about how your project is linked to projects that have been funded before? The review panel knows about projects that have been funded in the past, and so they were able to pick up in some instances, oh, there was a project quite a lot like this, we'd like to see that team talking to the team that led that other project. And also needing to show the distinctions between what's been funded in the past and what's being proposed in the new project. This next one, very common when applications are being written by teams and where they're kind of being iteratively developed in segments. The panel recognised in many applications that there were inconsistencies across sections. So perhaps that was in one instance that I recall, it was around terminology. So a data gathering process was described or it was listed in the budget, but it was not mentioned anywhere else in the application. And so making sure that everything lines up, that if you say you're going to have focus groups, then you talk about those in the various sections of the application that are relevant, and then you budget for them and you justify it in the budget as well, ensuring that there's not a mismatch between the sections. And then the final one that there was quite a lot of comments around was impact, the importance of going beyond doing some interesting writing about the project. So the kind of the knowledge generation aspect of the project, making sure that this was also something that would result in actual change in the lived experience for students, for academic staff, for professional staff, and so on, going beyond just journal articles and the required final report written documents. So they were sort of the key things. You'll know, of course, that there were all kinds of other topics canvassed, but I wanted to give you a sort of a top level overview of the things that arose most often as the really key areas of critique. And then I thought you might be interested to see, and this is a very extremely blunt measure of feedback, but it's something that you couldn't know because you don't see all the other feedback documents. Just to give you a sense of the volume of feedback and the kind of the top note of what the panel was saying about each one. So it ranged from like 1 1/4 pages of feedback with a general impression from the panel that they were impressed by what the team was proposing, down to 3 1/2 pages of detailed feedback where the comments, the overarching comments were things like, this shows potential, but a whole lot of things need to be fixed. Or we can see that this idea is time critical, but fundamental redevelopment is required. So that gives you a sense of the spectrum. You also will see that even for projects that were seen as really great ideas, convincing and worthwhile, they still received pretty voluminous feedback. So there's a really high degree of support from the panel to get these ideas as feasible and compelling and well-formed as possible before they come in for final submission as the next step. So I might pause there and ask if there's any comments, questions, reflections before we move on. The other thing to say about the feedback, well, 2 things. One is that you, and I think we talked about this in individual meetings, don't feel obliged to take all of the feedback on board. It is your application, and there may be things that that you do not agree with in terms of the panel feedback. Completely appropriate, but you do want to articulate your reasoning to the panel so that they understand that you've made a reasoned decision to do things otherwise. And even if you don't agree with the solution that the panel may have offered you in the feedback, the fact that they offered it suggests that there might be a better way to explain the thing that you were seeking to explain, perhaps not by solving it in their suggested way, but doing something in the rewriting to remove that concern from their minds. And then the other thing to say on that point is that as much as possible, Marlene will match make your final application with the same reviewers who read your application in detail. in the preliminary draft round. So you'll be speaking in your application directly to those reviewers who know your application well already and have put in that legwork of reviewing your preliminary draft. Sometimes it's not possible to pair the same people again because people are on leave or other things are going on. But in general, you're going to be read in depth by the same people who read your preliminary, which makes the reflective statement a powerful place to have a conversation with those panelists and the review panel at large about where you're up to, about what's changed, what stayed the same, that kind of thing.
Tilly, can I ask, how many panelists usually review a grant application? 2. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
2, and then the panel comes together in a Zoom meeting, and one of the reviewers who's read it in depth will speak to it, and then the other reviewer will chime in as well. And then in the meeting, we have access to everybody's application, and so often that will be opened up on screen, and then all of us will kind of dive deeper into the feedback.
Yeah, the majority of the feedback that you receive is from the 2 reviewers that do the initial review outside of the review panel meeting. There are some points in each section that may be brought up at the review panel meeting by the other reviewers that haven't actually looked at yours. So yeah, you get a combination, but most of it is from the 2 that have done the initial review. So, and that is where I'm going to try to send your application back to those same 2 initial reviewers. But yeah, it will be across the board for the review panel.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Tilly.
All right, so let's talk editing and polishing practical tips about this. So I really like this quote because I find it kind of reassuring. This comes from a guidebook about how to write massive grant applications for seeking funding for big centres and programs. And it's about the ripple effect of making changes in a grant application. And it reassures me that the consistent and making sense are experienced across the board by grant writers. And this analogy I think is great. So in the middle of this quote, they say, with multiple stone throwers, otherwise known as authors, tossing ideas around in multiple ponds, otherwise known as sections of the proposal, an inordinate amount of splashing can ensue and can result in numerous inconsistencies in the document. And I don't know how your writing process has felt, but I know for me, co-authoring, I often feel like there's a lot of splashing around in the pond. We throw in the rock of an idea, we realize that rock didn't really work, and so we dive in and extract it from the pond. And then you end up with this document that really needs to be wrangled back into shape so that those inconsistencies are ironed out before it gets to the panel. And this is kind of what editing is for. So we edit for several different things. One is to remove the distracting errors. Like Mina, I think you were saying before, sending your copy to a proofreader highlighted to you things that you had overlooked over and over again. That then seem really obvious once a proofreader picks them up. They also will typically seem obvious to the review panel. And so you don't want reviewers getting distracted by the fact that there are, missing full stops, or that a few lines of your text were not being picked up by the spell check and have typos in them. You want them really to focus on the robust core of your application, not to be distracted by errors. So that's the first reason to edit. And then, of course, coherence, which is kind of what that quote is getting at, that we want the document to hold together and to make sense. We want it to be persuasive. And so editing is a way of checking that as an argument, the application is as convincing as it possibly can be. We want clarity, and that's really important in a grant application because you're making promises about how you're going to deliver on your project. And you want those promises to be really clear, both so that the panel are convinced that they are a good set of promises that they're keen to support, but also so that when you are successful in winning the money and starting the grant project, you all have clarity around what you agreed to do as a team and what promises you made for for receiving the money. Compliance is another key reason for editing. Making sure that everything that's in the SALT grant procedures is addressed in your application document is really important. And so that's things like using the correct headings of the template, making sure you deleted the blue supporting text, making sure your word limits are no more than the plus 10% that we talked about earlier, those kinds of things, that all sections are complete. And then consistency, that what you're budgeting for is the same as the research activities that you're describing, the way that your research approach is described lines up with the timeline, that all of it is internally consistent. So that's why we edit. They're the kinds of checkpoints that you want to make sure you're hitting as you're engaging in editing this final version. And how do we do that? Well, Microsoft Word does it on a fairly basic level by default, but it can do it on a much more sophisticated level if you go into your options, into the proofing menu, and then in grammar settings, by default, you'll find most of those boxes unticked that you can see in that screenshot on my slide. I really encourage you to go in and tick almost all of those boxes so that you get a more robust grammatical critique of your application as you're writing it in Word or whatever your equivalent word processor is. So I recommend doing that. And then the other thing, and this sounds really obvious, but I think all of us have fallen into the trap of not doing this. I know for sure that I have, and lots of people have lamented to me that they have, to make sure that Word is actually checking your entire application. Because for some reason or other, it can often happen that big chunks of your text are marked with that tick box that says, do not check spelling and grammar. And so it all looks good. There's no green or red wavy lines underneath things, and you get a false impression that it's okay, but it's just because you've told it not to check that segment. So making sure that you Control A to select the entire text, and then go into the language options and set it to Australian English and untick the do not check box, and that will iron out that potential problem. Really important to do that. Can't tell you how many times it has tripped people up. Another tool is to outsource the work. So to engage a professional editor, a proofreader, or even just a colleague, friend, family member who has a real eagle eye attention to detail. They can do that task as well. It also can be good as a side effect of that, in that it gives you and your team a bit of a break from staring at the document. There's nothing like leaving it for a couple of days just to get some headspace from it. You can do the same, of course, by passing it off to colleagues and team members. If one of you has been so deep in the process of writing, passing it on to somebody else in the team to do a fresher edit can be a good thing to do. Making sure that you're saving versions appropriately and doing document management so that in all the editing you don't lose any of the good stuff in a reckless moment of doing a whole lot of changing or deleting that you might change your mind about. So making sure that you're saving versions that you can go back to, and maybe keeping the document that we've talked about at previous workshops, a prunings file or a cuttings file, where everything that you get rid of, you just keep it in a side document, just in case you ever want to reference it back. Or even if you don't, it just kind of makes you feel better about deleting it because it persists there in your files for reference later on. The absolute superpower of editing is to read your writing out loud. There's almost nothing that will reveal as many opportunities for improvement as just sitting at your screen seeming like a crazy person and reading your application out loud, because you're going to notice things like you couldn't breathe until the end of the sentence and you almost ran out of breath. If that's the case, your sentences are probably too long. You're going to notice that some things just sound funny. They sound clunky or awkward. That's going to mean probably that you want to simplify your language and make it much more approachable and plain English. remembering that you're writing for an intelligent audience, but a non-discipline expert audience. Marlene?
Just another point on that reading out loud. One of our award applicants said that he puts things into Google Translate, which reads it out for you. So if you're not confident that you pick something up reading it with your own voice, if you put it in someone else's voice to read it back to you, that can also help.
Yeah, definitely. You can also, if you can bear it, you can record yourself reading it and then listen to that recording back. You can do that on your computer, or you can just do it on a simple recording app on your phone and then listen to it back with your hands poised at the keyboard to be correcting things as you're hearing the problems emerge in your own voice as you read out loud. So that's a really powerful thing to do. Hard copy editing, there is so much that happens on screen. As soon as you print a document out, you will find errors, typos, missing punctuation, and just poorly written content. You'll find it in an instant as soon as it's on paper. And it's just because we filter things differently on screen to paper, and by disrupting that and printing it out, you'll see a whole lot more. Also, you can hard copy edit in a different place to where you've done the writing, which again is just going to make your brain much more flexible about what it notices. If you're editing at the very same desk using the very same computer setup and keyboard that you've used to write this document, your pattern-making brain is going to be inserting a whole lot of sensibility into the document that isn't actually there, like things that you thought you wanted to write, you'll kind of read them into it, and you'll miss all kinds of opportunities to improve the text. So print it out and then read it with a pen in your hand at a cafe or sitting on the bench outside or at your home office rather than at work, or vice versa, to disrupt the auto correction that your brain's going to be doing when you're reading it on screen. Out of sequence editing does kind of the same thing, and what I mean by that is doing things like reading it from the final section back to the opening section. It just disrupts what you're expecting to read and shows you more of what is actually there. So that's a good thing to do. Changing your view, so that's about doing it somewhere else, or even tricks like print it in a different color or print it on a different color of paper. All of that will highlight opportunities to improve it. I often also will just paste shorter segments of text, but I will paste them into a different platform. Like I might put, if I'm working really hard on, say, the need for the project section, which I know has to be conversational and persuasive because that's it's the hook by which you grab the attention of the review panel. I might post it into a much more social medium than Microsoft Word is, like into my Facebook, for example, not with any intention of sharing it with my Facebook friends, but because as soon as it's in that interface of Facebook, my brain is switching into conversation, persuasion, knowing that my intelligent but non-expert friends are going to read it. And I will notice, for example, typically that the language is too clunky and academic. Just by seeing it surrounded by that blue box with those little icons that remind my brain that Facebook is a means of social connection. And so I never press post because wouldn't be of interest to anybody, but it adjusts my sensibilities as an author. And it can be really useful to do that. Likewise, you might post it into a blog if you have one, into Twitter, into Instagram, something that reminds you of what you're seeking, the effect that you're seeking to have on your audience. And then another strategy, and I'll show you an example of this as we get near the end of our time together today, is a personalized style guide, so that rather than every single time you encounter a stylistic choice, like is a particular word hyphenated, do you use single or double quotation marks, when you name a phenomenon, is it a proper noun or like a regular noun, and therefore is it capitalized or not? Rather than making that decision every single time you encounter that decision-making point, creating a style guide that just tells you what your own rules are, that you always hyphenate these particular pairs of words, that you always use an Oxford comma, the one that precedes the final and in a list of things, and so on, so that you're not as a team thinking, yeah, do we use Oxford commas or do we not? You just agree that you do or you don't. Do we use Harvard or do we use Chicago? Well, you just agree which one you use and which version of it, and you pop all of that into your style guide so that you've got consistent rules and you minimize the cognitive complexity of it, because let's face it, you're making more than enough decisions in writing this application. You don't want to be making style decisions over and over again, partly because you don't have time to, but also because it's a recipe for inconsistency if you keep making them on the fly. One of the challenges at this point in your application writing process is going to be making your application shorter, because as most of you noted when we had our one-on-one meetings, the panel didn't ever, I think it's fair to say didn't ever ask you to take content out of your application. They asked you to add more things in. And so the obvious dilemma of space. Here are some things that you can do to make your application shorter. They're really practical things. They're about searching for words that are getting in the way. They're about making sure that your structure is correct. And one of the key ways to do this is making sure that every single paragraph that you include in the application has a clear purpose. Getting rid of excessive detail and making sure that you use all of the word allocations that there are. So for example, in the budget justification, some people write that section really quite briefly. And I always think that that spot is an opportunity to like milk a little more mileage out of the words that you've got, because you can fit more in there. So making sure that you use all of the words you've got, have every paragraph doing the one job, and then comb through it for clutter. Have you got long sentences? If so, make them short. Have you got redundancies where you use two words to say the one word, you know, like a person raced quickly, or a person began with the first initiative. You can't begin with anything other than a first initiative. So, you know, skimming out all that stuff. Words like in particular, therefore, indeed, quite, so, very, that. We tend to use a lot of those words in our writing, and they can all go and the meaning becomes clearer. Also, if you're having other people read your applications, it's usually really hard for people to suggest that you delete segments of your writing because they know how hard you've worked on it. And so a good tip is to say to a person reading it, if you had to delete something from this application, what would you get rid of? It gives them license to be more critical than their natural tendency is going to lead them to be. And it will get you good advice about where you might have been repetitive or provided an unnecessary amount of detail. Loads of resources for doing this. These are hyperlinked, so when you get the slides, you'll be able to go directly to them. The marketing folks at CQU have got a writing style guide. It's written for a different purpose, but it's very much worth having it as a reference about naming conventions and stylistic conventions particular to CQ University, so I commend that to you. And then a range of links at the bottom of the page. We're going to have a play with a few of those in just a second with you using your own application, but let me tell you about the ones that we're not going to look at in this presentation. So naturalreaders.com is similar to what Marlene was describing before with Google Translate. It's a site where you can paste your text in and it will read it back to you in a good naturalistic voice. So that's an alternative to reading out loud to yourself. And Noisely is great if you struggle with focus when you're writing. It's a noise generator that gives you cafe noise, white noise, the sound of raindrops, all kinds of noises that have been shown to be efficacious in improving people's focus as they work. And you can create that noise kind of to your liking. You can add or take out the sounds of rain and a crackling fire and all kinds of nice things. So I recommend both of those to you. But the others are these ones that you're seeing on the screen now. So there's Grammarly, Typely, the Hemingway app, and word count tools. I want to invite you to take a segment of your text, and I think the ones that most readily will lend themselves to doing this is either your need section or your impact and success section. And I want to give you 5 minutes just to throw that text into one or more of these websites and see what happens, see what it comes back with. I'm going to say, just to forecast it, that Grammarly is the most detailed kind of critique that you will get back about grammar and spelling. Typely, I think, goes way too gentle on your text. I don't think it's robust enough, but worth having a look at. Hemingway app is excellent in that it just focuses on about, I think it's 4 or 5 kind of deadly sins of writing, like passive sentences, complex sentences. And so that's good for getting a very quick snapshot of how could I powerfully improve my text. And then word count tools is kind of forensic. It does things for you like ascertaining your longest sentence, the complexity of words that you're using, the reading grade level of what you've written. It can generate a list of your most frequently used either single words or phrases. And it will tell you your average sentence length, and we're going to talk in a minute about sentence length. So unless there's any questions, I'm going to stop talking for the next 4 or 5 minutes and just leave you that time to have a play with one or more of those tools.
Oh, thanks, Tilly. I'm just trying to log into grammarly.com, and it asks me to continue with Google or register.
I have used it without having any kind of login, so that's interesting that it's asking you to do that. If you're comfortable to continue with Google, that will get you in. And if it proves to be difficult, maybe skip on to one of the next options.
Do I need to, sorry, yes?
I was just going to say, I just tried as well, and I opened it in Chrome, and it says that it's free to add it to Chrome.
Okay, now do you think that I should be uploading my whole document there?
I recommend for this purpose that you just copy and paste either your need section or your impact section and just paste it into that box.
I've noticed that Grammarly is asking me to
Upload
as well with my own account.
It is asking to upload the document.
So I'm just trying to. I had a previous account for Grammarly, but it's asking me to log in now, and I can't remember my password, so I'm just resetting it.
Okay. And maybe for now, try one of the others. Try Hemingway or Typely or word count tools.
I tried Hemingway as well. The one for the desktop version is asking you to pay $19.99 to use it. I was thinking it was going to be for free.
Yeah. So this is very odd. Let me try and see what is happening. What if you just Google Hemingway app rather than typing that URL in? For me, when I do that, it comes up as my very first option. What happens for you?
I'm looking at it now. It's hemingwayapp.com desktop.html, but it needs me to buy the app.
So what do you have in your actual URL address? Is it just hemingwayapp.com?
That's right, /desktop.html.
So get rid of that desktop HTML bit.
Okay.
You just want it to stop at the .com. And then what should happen, Manjo, is that you should get to a kind of quite colourful page that says Hemingway app makes your writing bold and clear. Is that working for you?
We'll see. Okay, edit. Okay, I'm seeing it now. Yeah, it does work.
Excellent. And then with Hemingway, you're going to delete all that sample text that's in there and replace it with your segment of writing.
Yeah, thanks.
And then, yeah, I think the secret to Grammarly is to use it within Chrome. I think that's why it's working for Marlene and me. I just want to give you another kind of 2 minutes or so to finish this little trial. Has that been enough time to get something in there and have a look at it? And if so, it would be great, Mina and Manjo, if you would just share something that you uncovered about that section of text by looking at it in one of these online editors.
Do we start doing that now?
Yeah.
Okay. I've actually had a chance to use Grammarly in the past, but I don't like Grammarly in the sense that I don't really agree with a lot of the comments that it gives.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, I think that I can be a better editor and writer than Grammarly because of the algorithm that they have there. And
yes,
although I've tried using it in the past, to me it doesn't work. And I'm using the one, I'm using Hemingway now. I've tried it. And again, I don't feel like it's helpful to me, right? Because like I'm looking at it now, I was looking at the one about the niche section, and it's flagging that most of what I've written is very hard to read. It probably is. It probably is for the algorithm. But if we were to, if we were to put a lot of the top journal manuscripts in Hemingway or Grammarly, these apps are probably going to flag them as difficult to read. So I wonder if, they're probably helpful for undergrads, but not to the level of academic writing, especially if you put in, low journal articles. Grammarly and Hemingway are probably just going to say that this is rubbish. And so I tend not to really use it because to me it's extremely unhelpful. And well, but I understand, I understand the value. There are a few things which I think can be helpful, but No, I prefer my own. What I probably will be doing is actually to suggest to my team members to have a look again at the manuscript or the application and to provide some suggestions, because to rely on, I would think that, you know, Grammarly and Hemingway are probably helpful to those who really struggle with writing, but to those who are quite used to writing, I'm not sure if they're helpful at all. In fact, to me, you know, it just, I could break up the sentences simply to make them more simple, but that's not the way we write. You know. So I mean, those are just
I'm glad
my views.
You definitely have to take into account this issue that Manjaro has raised, that it's algorithmically looking for a simpler style of writing.
I was trying to do the one from the one about conquering the mega grant and put it in Hemingway, the first paragraph as well, and it's saying 2 of 7 sentences are very hard to read. There's so many comments there.
Yeah, so Hemingway does that hard to read assessment, and I think that's one that we definitely have to take with a grain of salt. However, Hemingway does passive sentences, which are a great thing to avoid in application writing. So I think Hemingway is useful for checking on passive sentences.
Yeah.
Grammarly, I think, you know, it often comes back with so many suggestions, but it's quite a lot of, it's cumbersome to filter through. Hemingway, I like the simplicity of it, but absolutely point taken that it's assessing your writing against a different standard to that which you know is appropriate. So it's a way of looking into your writing, but it's not the answer. And absolutely your own judgment is going to be a much more powerful tool in this. Mina, how about you? What did you try out, and what are your...
Right, I tried Impact and Success on Grammarly, and it is giving you so many heavy, you know, already sent it to the proofreader and few more people around our team. And I really do not agree with what Grammarly.com is suggesting. So, not just few hyphens is okay, I can understand that. For example, real time, so real -time, fine. But not to all what Grammarly.com is suggesting. I haven't tried the others though. So
yeah. So they're a way into your text, but they're not the answer to it, because we can't force our intellects in this way. The final one, word count tools, we're going to talk about now or in a moment. That does have some really useful things, because it's not so much recommending changes, but rather it's just forensically having a look at your text and telling you things about it. So this slide is in here as a refresher of the hallmarks that we talked about of writing a good grant application. So I won't go through those, but you've got them there for reference. I want to quickly whip now through 3 levels of working with your text. So we're going to talk whole text, we're going to talk paragraphs, and then we're going to talk about sentences. So at the whole text level, the major goal here is to make sure that the text works in its entirety, that what you say is in alignment, that it's internally consistent, and also that it's in alignment with the procedural requirements. So here we're talking about, does it have the right elements? Does it have the right word counts? Have you included the things that you need to? And are you following the rules? A useful thing to do can be to use word count tools, or if you're more visual, you can use this word cloud site to have a look at the keyword density or application. Just as another way of interrogating your text, you want to make sure that the key ideas are showing up in the keyword density of your text. Again, your judgment is going to be more powerful, but if you're tiring of your text and you just want another way to examine it, then mapping out keywords can be a useful thing to do. Most advice about writing says that you should cut any draft, even a near final draft, by about 1/3. That is a pretty extreme amount to edit out of an almost finished document, but it's kind of useful to have it in mind. Can you take out 1/3 or so of extra words in sentences, maybe extra sentences that don't serve a purpose. Just have it in the back of your mind that good writing is heavily edited writing. Think about using white space effectively in your application. You are guided by word counts, not by page length. And so use white space to give your reader visual rest. Give their eyes somewhere to go that is not crowded with text. And make a style guide and a finalization checklist, and I'll show you examples of those in a moment. Really helpful documents in the final sprint of developing an application. Paragraphs. Paragraphs are all about promises. And so at this point in your application, you want to be checking that every paragraph in your application makes one single promise, that it has a purpose that you flag in the opening sentence and remind us of in the closing sentence. And then also checking that the sequencing of paragraphs has got a logic to it. And then as you're checking those, you can also be checking that your referencing approach has been consistently applied, particularly if you're working across disciplines, which most teams are. You may be using a discipline, a referencing system that is not familiar to everybody in the team. So make sure that it is all consistently Harvard or all consistently APA or whatever approach you have decided to take. And a good thing to do just in terms of mapping it at the paragraph level is on a hard copy, write a marginal note next to every single paragraph of the 1 or 2 words describing what job that paragraph is doing. And if you find a paragraph that's trying to do way too many things, make it simpler and split them out into separate paragraphs. I know that sounds obvious and it sounds a little elementary, but it is something that dramatically improves people's application writing, even at, you know, the national grant level when we used to have national learning and teaching grants problem in applications, even though it sounds like, yeah, of course. So then sentences, go through them, but there's a list of the mean sentence lengths of various different genres. Now I've put in there the award applicant average sentence length. I haven't done the same count for grant applications, but you could do it for your own using wordcounttools.com and just see where you track. You want to be at the lower end of this because you're all about writing in an accessible, easily digestible way for your interested but non-expert lay reader on the review panel. So try and be more J.K. Rowling's or perhaps Dickens, much less than you're trying to be Chaucer. And there's a great article, there's a link to it there that was this issue around the length of sentences. Most sentences can do well with being split in half. And then in terms of words, at the word level, you want to be using active, not passive voice. You want to be avoiding these kind of crutch words that just get in the way of meaning. The word that, the words very and really and make. They can almost all go from your application. And where you've used complicated words, you might be really well placed to just replace it with a much simpler word. So again, interrogate your text, find what your longest words are, think about whether they need to be so cumbersome or can you communicate it in a more accessible way. I'm not going to go through these, but I just wanted to share with you a fantastic book about effective writing, which is this one. It's in, I think it's in its 9th edition. It was published in the 70s. You're too busy writing your grant applications. Yeah, 76. You're too busy writing your applications to have time to read this book, so I extracted for you 2 slides of what I think is William Binz's very best advice about how to write well, and so you have that for reference. I like this second last point where he says, effortless style is achieved by strenuous effort and constant refining. And that's the name of the game, isn't it? You want it to read so easily. And we only get to that by working really incredibly hard to make it look like we wrote it so easily. A a quick word on budget justification, just to say that in a few applications, people missed this section altogether, or they wrote justifications that were not especially compelling. So I wanted to share this example, which Marlene extracted a while ago, of a good way to write a budget justification. So you can see it goes line item by line item. It doesn't just restate what the money is being spent on, but it says why. The other thing that a good budget justification does is it shows the review panel that you've done your homework about how much things cost. So, for example, transcription services notoriously under budgeted for in applications, because transcription, well, it takes either a long time or a lot of money. And so justifying it in this way shows that you've seriously thought about how you're going to do it. You're saying that you're going to use a commercial service. You've given an example of a name of them, so you're not just wildly kind of predicting that you'll find one. You're saying what will be recorded, and then you're estimating the hours, and then because most of those services charge by the minute, you're showing that you've calculated that out into minutes, and what format it's going to come back to you in. So this justification section, really powerful place to prove to the review panel that you are on top of the feasibility aspects of your project. So use it powerfully. Any questions or comments just on that budget point? I just wanted to throw this in. It's a bit off topic from editing and writing, but because it did emerge quite frequently in the panel discussions, I wanted to just share this example with you. No, okay. So the final lap, so close to the end of this application process that's been a while.
Tilly, can I go back to that point about the budget justification? So I've noticed there that bullet points were used. Is that preferable to just coming up with paragraphs?
That's my mistake. They were used because I pasted it into PowerPoint and it defaulted to bullet points.
Is it preferable? Or it doesn't really matter?
Well, it should have the heading bolded so that they can separate what you're actually talking about. But yeah, other than that, just paragraph about each thing. So, you know, just a narrative style paragraph explaining why, what it is and why, you know.
I can't remember now. Was this going to be in the Word file or in the Excel file?
In the Word file.
In the Word file. Okay, so we're missing that. So we should be putting in the particular, you know, the particular heading for the cost and then put it in bold letters. So we're going to adopt that. That's good.
Yeah, those bolded headings there, they're the actual budget item that are itemized in the spreadsheet.
Yeah.
So yeah, each item that you've itemized in there, I mean, you can put travel and accommodation together. If you split it up in the spreadsheet, that just allows you to see that you haven't missed anything. Yeah. But yeah, if you wanted to put it together, that's fine as well. Just as long as it's clear to the reviewer that this is what we need the money for, and this is why.
And then for coherence and readability, I'd encourage you as much as you can to list these items out in the same sequence that they're showing up in your budget, so that for ease of reading, the reader can see it as a line item and then know whether they should jump to the middle or the beginning or the end of your justification. It might get slightly awry when you're grouping things, but in general, try and do it that way so that there's a logic to it.
Can I just make a comment again about Grammarly?
Please.
Because I was playing around with it, you know, while we were talking just to see it again. There were, in fact, a number of errors which I actually missed. So I think it still helps. You know, the minor errors which your mind, your eyes would typically gloss over. So they are helpful in that sense. The proofreading errors, maybe not so much the sentence structure because that's probably too complex. But, you know, the small things which everybody can pick up. These are things which, you know, the app, especially Grammarly, seems to be quite helpful for. So I'm going to use it.
I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, it has a place. It's not the only tool, but it definitely has a place. So, characteristics of a good application. You want it to excite your readers. to have a unique value proposition, to go right back to that lean canvas that we began this process with. And it might be timely to have a peek at that. It's probably a while since you've looked at it. What's the unique thing that you, your team, this moment in time bring to the project? Emphasizing that is going to make your application compelling to the review panel. I won't go through each of these other than to emphasize the final two, which is that you want to make sure that you're generating both actual change at CQU and knowledge production. Don't get caught in that trap of thinking that just because we're saying we're going to publish to X number of journals and write the final report that we are done and dusted with this project. The panel care about you producing knowledge, and they equally care about you generating actual change for the lived experience of people at CQU. So make sure you cover off both. And then the final obvious point, but perhaps one of the most challenging one, is write your application well, and you're definitely on track to do that. If things are feeling blocked, there's various suggestions here of ways to break that. You're fortunate that you're all working in teams, and so you can do things like reallocating team roles to freshen people's perspective. If somebody's been doing the bulk of the writing, maybe you switch that out and get somebody else to do a chunk of writing. Find somebody on the team who's excellent at crossing T's and dotting I's and make them your compliance person, and they can pore over the procedures document and the template and make sure that you've done every single thing that's expected of you. At this point, taking a real genuine break from the application may be timely as well, just putting it to rest for a minute or handballing it to someone else in your team for a minute. The Pomodoro technique can be a good one if you need some extra assistance with focusing. You'll find heaps about it online, but it's essentially a disciplined practice of doing 25 minutes of focused single tasking activity, a 5-minute break, repeating that for several times, and then having a longer 15-minute break, and just being absolutely quarantined about, I am doing this one thing in this 25-minute slot of time. Will get you tremendously powerful in reducing the clutter and the distraction of all the other things that get in the way. Named after the Italian tomato cooking timer that was very popular in the 1970s, I believe. Your reflective statement is really important. We talked about this in our individual meetings. Make sure you use that reflective statement to document things that you've changed and things that you've opted not to change and the reason why. You also probably will delete most of what was in your reflective statement in the preliminary draft round, because you're going to want to use that space to write commentary about this final version that you're submitting. So don't feel like you need to do a sort of like an archaeological dig of these are the changes we made the first time round and why, and then this is what we did this time around and why, because you're not going to have space to do that. Just focus on the most recent set of feedback and the final application, and just talk the panel through what you've done and where you're at with all of that.
So, Tilly, can I assume that that is actually, you know, the what you just said to us now, can I assume that in a sense we're essentially embarking on a new section there about the reflective statement, which potentially can disregard a substantial part of the initial reflective statement we rewrote, which was in response to the initial feedback. Would that be correct? So that we focus on the feedback we're getting as of, you know, the most recent one. Would that be correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. It might be that you said things in your initial reflective statement that still stand. Like you might have said, I don't know, we're keeping a close watch on curriculum developments within our school because they may affect how our project rolls out. Now, if that is still true, you would still want to say it. But in terms of the conversation around the feedback, it's going to be much more useful to you to just address the most recent batch of feedback and the final. These slides are in here for your reference, not because I'm going to go through them one by one. It's just a reminder that the review panel are assessing you against a very hefty set of criteria. There are a lot of them. And so I would encourage you in your teams, maybe delegate it to an individual in the team, or maybe you do it together, to look at your application critically through the lens of the criteria, because that's what the review panelists will be doing. And looking at it this way gets you up from in amongst the weeds. We've talked quite a bit today about being down in the weeds, you know, the details of checking your application against the, make sure that you have everything in there that the panel is going to need to rate you well. Panelists rate you both numerically and provide open-ended comments on all of these criteria. So test your application out, see how it goes in terms of need, aim, theoretical framework, etc., etc. All of these are in the procedures document. If you're thinking, where did these come from? They're in the Appendix D of the procedures. Marlene?
Can I just mention that last lot of reviewing that we did, we only had I think it was 5 questions that were numerically rated. The rest was about the qualitative feedback. So, I mean, it combines some of these criteria together in the review that takes the quantitative feedback into account. So you'll receive the assessment form before you have to put your final application in. So you'll be able to see which ones are actually numerically rated and which ones the panel will be looking at in terms more of the qualitative.
Yes, yeah, we grouped them together because 19 judgments is a lot to make. So we grouped them into clusters. But yeah, like Marlene says, you'll see that because you'll get a copy of the assessment form that the panel uses. I mentioned before having a style guide particular to your work. This is my style guide for the history research that I do. And I just wanted to share it with you. The content of it will not be relevant, but the format of it, just to show you what a style guide can look like. So in it, you would have a word list that describes what you do with particular words, like are they hyphenated, are they, how are they spelt, if there are options about spelling, and so on. And then a list of rules about how things get capitalized, what you do with your headings, what gets put in italics, what kinds of quotes you use, that kind of thing. So this can be a great thing to develop. It's hard work to do it the first time, but then you just keep adding to it and you end up with this kind of personalized system of what you do with complicated stylistic decisions, and they become uncomplicated, which is a lovely thing. It's a document that you just keep adding to as you go on. So there's that. And the other is, I mentioned before, the idea of having a finalization checklist. This is an example of just the level of micro detail that you might include in a checklist. And I would really urge you to make one of these as you're getting ready to do the final submission. In here, you communicate to yourself, or in your case to your team, about the things that you know need to happen before you're ready to press submit. And so then you just tick them off, and then you know that it is indeed ready. And so you would be writing this with the procedures in hand. This one is not to do with SALT grants. It was my PhD submission. That was the quickest one I could find that kind of made sense. Changes all the time, but this was my kind of final sprint a couple of years ago to get the document in. So it reminded me to do things like check that the numbers are sequential, make sure that I add in the cat photograph, you know, the detail that's specific to what you need to do to get finished. So I commend that to you. If you put it in something like Google Docs, then all of your team could be adding to it and also ticking things off as they get things done, or writing their names against them or whatever. If you're working as a team, you might want to make this a little more elaborate with columns for different people's responsibilities or color coding or something. but just this idea of a very micro detailed checklist that reminds you of the key things that need to be done. And so in finishing, you're really wanting to ask yourselves at this final sprint stage, have we proposed a project that's viable? Is it a project that will make a difference to somebody and be generalizable beyond its initial scope? And is it a project that needs to be funded now? If you can create a sense of urgency with the panel that this is the moment to support this research, then your application will be all the more compelling. And then the final one, which is crucially important, is have we followed the rules? Because we don't want to have your great ideas being diluted by the fact that you've missed some crucial section or you've gone 50% over the word count and therefore you've broken that requirement. So they're the questions that you're asking at this final stage. And as I was saying before, the one key date that is left is September 10, very late at night. Your final applications are due. And I would invite you as your next step with your team to think about what action steps do you need to take now. And there's a couple of kind of areas of action that you might like to consider with your team. Working on the feedback and other revisions, working on the well-being and cohesion of your team, thinking about time and workflow of what happens between here and September 10, and thinking about people and relationships outside of the team. Who do you need to enlist as your change enablers, your champions, your supporters? Who might you need to call in favors from? How might you go with getting the endorsements within your school? Anything to do with people and relationships. So I would urge you as a next step to think across those 4 domains and to agree on some action steps of how to proceed. So a final few minutes for questions, discussion on anything. It could be about the topic of today or anything else to do with your grant.
I have a question, Tilly. The theme about the team members' well-being, it came up again in that last slide. What is the idea behind that?
It's the idea of taking care of ourselves, right? That we're all under lots of time pressure. Writing these applications can be really hard work. And so just to ensure that, that the team is working well in the application stage, and to build a culture in your team of of working effectively together.
To check in on each other on how we're doing, or what? Is that a suggestion?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the culture of your team. You'll all do things differently. But yeah, I would encourage you to do that for sure. You know those theories of group development, that any team is going to go through its complex stages, forming, storming, norming, all of that. There's going to be some tough times in any project team. And so being proactive about those can be a powerful thing.
And it could also be that you've assigned someone else to do part of the proposal, but if they're overwhelmed or whatever and they don't get around to it, then that part of the proposal is going to fall down a little bit. So yeah, it's just, I guess, checking in. As
yeah.
Before.
Yeah.
Maybe the other question I have, or perhaps it's a suggestion, looking at team cohesion and well-being, especially for those who do get their applications funded. I wonder if the learning and teaching services are able to provide workshops or suggestions on how we can make sure that the team continues to have that cohesiveness, and that we're able to work together. Because to me, it's like for a team to be successful, sometimes we don't really know how to get how to work along these lines. So it's one thing for us to work on the grant application, but then to implement the project as a team, that might require a different set of skills. And I wonder if we might be able to get assistance on that, or that's something that we should be working on our own.
Yeah, it's a good point. We're currently working on reshaping the grants program for next year. And so we will definitely take that into that discussion. But in terms of support for those that are funded this year, I guess, Marlene, it's a conversation to have, isn't it, about what we could do?
Yeah. Yeah, and it'll probably depend a lot on when your project starts. There are points within the project where we check in with you. So we ask for a verbal report 6 months after the project started. So I mean that's where you can raise concerns with the chair, or the chair can raise concerns with you if something about your project doesn't seem to be sitting quite right or fitting quite right. But yeah, earlier in the program, earlier in the process of your project would probably be a little better, say around February next year. If it starts in January, that is. Or even if it starts in November, just a couple of months in rather than the 6 months, because 6 months it's almost too late.
Yeah, exactly. I'm mindful of the time, and so we're kind of officially done, but if you have any other comments or questions, please feel free to stay on the line and we can keep chatting. But I want to wish you all the best for this final stretch, and very excited to see your final applications come in mid-September.
Thank you, Tilly and Marlene. I'm just hoping that the PowerPoint slides we used today would be immediately available, while the things the things which were discussed are still fresh in my mind, because I think they're very helpful. I'd like to grab hold of them straight away.
Is that possible, or do you need to do some tweaks?
I could actually just share the Dropbox link right now. Should we do that?
Okay, and then when I send the link to the actual recording out, I'll attach them to that as well. So
perfect.
You'll get it twice, but you'll get the slides straight up.
Thank you.
Let me just bear with me while I make that happen, because that way you can just use it immediately. The one change I am going to make is I'm going to remove those bullet points from the budget justification slide. So if I could ask you maybe just not to share this with your teams yet. Share the one that Marlene sends you, which will have that slide fixed. But what you've got in the chat window now is a link to exactly what you've seen as we've moved through the session.
Very good, thank you.
No problem. All right, is there anything else?
Thanks.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, see you soon.
Thanks, Tilly. Thanks,
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.